Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about why Disney has abandoned its traditional audience. And I'm going to do that by looking at an older video from Bob Iger. Now this video is 5 years old, but that's kind of the point. We're going to look back at what he said 5 years ago and to see how that translates into what we see today with the failing properties over and over again from the various parts of Disney, which would include Disney itself, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, etc. And I'm going to analyze his words and tie them back to the original concepts of what he is discussing. The old axiom is that journalists write the first rough draft of history, and that's kind of what I feel like I'm doing here. I'm someone who studies the origin of ideas, where they come from and where they are going to, and I think that, 20, 30 years from now, this will be the rough draft, not my version, but someone's version, of the downfall of Disney and other like giant corporations which have abandoned their normal target audience. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that there are 3 links in the description and on the pinned comment for my 2 graphic novels. I have 2 superhero graphic novels, Thomas Valiant and The Valiant Heroes, both of them available at the Valiant Hero Indiegogo site, and my return to form for low fantasy, which is Crom the Destroyer. I focus on traditional virtuous heroes, death, honor, loyalty, and I tell them in a very traditional Western civilization storytelling kind of way. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from those books in the background. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. Now, first I'm going to go over the interview and take out snippets from it to discuss. And I wish I could just play parts of this for you, but I'm going to have to give it verbatim to you so that my video and my channel doesn't get dinged by YouTube. However, I will be providing the link in the description for the original YouTube interview, which is a Goldman Sachs interview with Bob Iger. Now, at the very first, there's an interesting little tidbit where the interviewer says, "You have a liberal arts background." And he says he thinks there is something to a liberal arts background that gets people thinking about things in a very specific, unique kind of way. And he is hitting the nail on the head right from the get-go, because that's where this kind of thinking of Bob Iger comes from. And I'll explain that later on. But let's move into some of these statements of Bob Iger himself. And yes, these are fairly long quotes, so hopefully you will bear with me so that we can get to the meat of this. So the interviewer asks Bob Iger, when he came into Disney, what did he think about the history of Disney, about preserving the history of Disney, and still at the same time making that history his own? And this is Bob Iger's long answer, which is extremely telling. He says, Disney, having been founded in 1923 by Walt Disney, still had an abnormal adherence to its legacy, to its heritage, to its past. It was a religion. And what was clear to me is that if that adherence, or the reverence that people had within the company for that heritage continued, it would get in the way of innovation. We would not be able to adapt quick enough. We would not be able to look at change with an open mind and an ability to seize the opportunity, as opposed to just looking at it as a threat. And so I started articulating in the succession process the need to balance heritage with innovation. And what I ultimately concluded was that we need to respect our past, because there are a lot of qualities about the past, the brand attributes, what Disney stood for, a number of other things, attention to quality, that had value and that should be basically carried forward into the future. But let's not revere it, because if we revere it, we might as well put it in a glass case, in a museum, and let people look at it. And there's a big difference. But there were a lot of folks in the company that were more on the reverential side than the respect side. And I had to really had to really attack that. In some cases, it meant changing our personnel. In some cases, it meant taking some big, bold decisions that felt anti-brand to some people, that, in my opinion, weren't at all. It was more about being pro-present and future than it was about anything that would be against the past or the brand. So that's the longest quote that I'm going to give you, and it's the most relevant. But he then goes on to talk about the brand of Disney and how Disney's brand has been around since the 20s and how is it still relevant when we live in a world, he says, that looks nothing like the 20s, even that looks nothing like 10 years ago. So he rhetorically then asks, how did we, Disney, retain our relevance? And this is his answer to that question. And I quote, "We looked at what the core values were of the brand. In Disney's case, it's things like, well, their storytelling values, but it's inclusion and universal appeal. It's good over evil. It's the value of hard work. It's the value of treating people well. It's optimism. It was all of those things. There was no need to move away from those core brand values, but we had to present them to the world in far more relevant ways." Then he goes on to talk about the fact, first of all, that Disney has not strayed from its core brand values, but that what he did next was to buy Pixar. And it's important to make that note because when he's talking about, as he explains, telling stories in a more relevant way to the world, he's talking about presenting them in the medium in which they are told. That is to say, with Pixar, according to computer-generated images and things like that, which are more relevant. Then, to skip ahead a bit, they talk about bringing all of these various companies under the umbrella of Disney. First Pixar, and then Lucasfilms and Marvel, and why and how that was done. And the reason for this that he gives is that those companies were brought under Disney because Disney wanted to invest in high-quality intellectual properties. And why that was important was because he saw disruptions in distribution in various ways happening, so he was hedging his bets because, as he says, quote, "Nothing is going to beat the power of a high-quality story." But he qualifies that by saying he also believed heavily in branding because he believed there was going to be a proliferation of good storytelling, and therefore they needed to have that high brand recognition for people to choose their storytelling over other kinds of storytelling because they're naturally going to go towards something they recognize. Then they move on to talking about the Black Panther movie, and you have to remember this interview is 5 years ago, so it was very relevant at that time. And the interviewer does ask a very interesting question, although he kind of hems and haws about it, but he's asking, was it a coincidence that this story about a black superhero came out at this time, again, which is 5 years ago? So obviously he's referring to some political upheaval, which is the times in which they live. And that, again, would be 5 years ago. If you're listening to this video sometime in the future, that would be 5 years from 2023 backwards. And he talks about how he meets with his team every once in a while, and they talk about projects that they want to have done. And he brought this up to the people at Marvel saying, let's do a Black Panther movie. And they hemmed and hawed about it themselves, and it appeared that he had so much pushback, although it didn't appear from what he states here that it was heavy pushback, but enough pushback from people saying, this is not going to sell, this is not going to do well, we can't do anything with this property. And he says that he realized that if he left it up to these people, they simply would not do it. Therefore, he told them, get it done. This was a mandate from him to do this. And the reason for that, he says, and I quote, "I felt that it was time for Marvel's storytelling to much better reflect the world we were doing business in. I'm a big believer in that, whether you call it diversity or inclusion, but the bottom line is that doing so is good for commerce. The world is obviously multicolored, multi-natured, and multifaceted. The more we infuse that into our stories, the better off we are." I'll have to note here that he also talks about wanting Marvel at that time to make the first black superhero movie, which shows that he doesn't really know what he's talking about when he's talking about black superhero movies, because there have been plenty of black superhero movies from Marvel and other companies long prior to that. Then the last few things he notes that I'm going to note here is number one, Black Panther was being written by Ta-Nehisi Coates in Marvel Comics, which he felt gave the character a pedigree. And then he notes that a number of people have come up to him saying, thank you for this movie because I finally get to show my children a movie where there's characters that look like them or where women are treated equal to men. All right, so let's now go back to the very first and start analyzing all of this that I have given you. Number one, it said that he has a liberal arts education. Now, I myself have a liberal arts education. I wish I had a classical education, but I don't. But what's the difference between a classical education and a liberal arts education? Well, classical education assumes in the background of the ideas being taught that there is the true, the good, and the beautiful. Now, this can take many forms, and it can be discussed in many different ways. It can be an assumption that God is real, or if you go back further, an assumption that the prime mover is an actual thing, if you want to go back to Aristotelian teachings, or go back to his teacher, who is Plato, and an assumption that there is a form of the good, all of this kind of thing. But what's a liberal education? Well, this liberal education is based upon the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was, we're going to reinvent all of academia in a way that has no reference to anything outside of the physical world. Now, there might be some mental discussion of these things, but there is never any assumption made that those things actually exist. There is no basis of the true, the good, the beautiful exists, and therefore, let's go from that premise onwards. It's always, no, those things don't exist. Let's look at what is left and move onward from that. And the point of why I bring that up is because, again, they talk about it here at the first of the interview, but it's because if you remove the classical education and its ideas of the true, the good, the beautiful, and you go with a liberal education, then there is in that liberal education, in the way that it's taught, no idea of the eternal, no idea of fixed points outside of the universe which govern things. So things are in constant change then, according to a liberal education. They're in constant change, constant flux. There's no real idea that you can place 100% assumption that it is true on, and therefore, again, things change and bend and move with the world. And this is the ideas of Bob Iger. Things move and bend and change with the world. And that would be words, stories, storytelling, everything else. So when he talks about these core values, he's at the same time redefining the core values for the present time. Because again, according to his educational background, there's no real fixed points. Now, you can make an assumption again of fixed points, and intellectually, there's people who tried to go into some transcendental thing that would substitute for the truth, the good, the beautiful in history. But anyways, none of that stuck, and we'll just have to go with liberal education means there is nothing outside of basically the physical world. Now, I know that's a broad statement to say the least, but it's the direction in which a lot of liberal education points the people who study in that form go to. And this is where Bob Iger goes to, because if we look at the other statements that he makes here, we'll see that he himself is an adherent of the ideas of diversity and inclusion. And not only diversity and inclusion, but also critical theory and specifically critical race theory. Because we see with his push of the Black Panther movie and the statements that he made around it, it's about race. That's what it's about. It's not about let's make a black superhero movie just because this is a good character. It's no, because of the race of this character, we're going to make this kind of movie, and it's a mandate from him. And oh, by the way, it is given some pedigree by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a big proponent of what? Critical race theory. And of course, he has people coming up to him, thanking him so that their children can watch a movie with people of the same skin color as them, which are ideas that come from critical race theory, and where women can be treated the equal of men, which is not exactly critical race theory, but comes from an origin point of critical race theory, which is intersectional feminism. Which by that, I mean the idea that women and men are not treated equally today and that women are still oppressed is an idea from intersectional feminism. So let's for a moment take all of these statements and trace them back to their origin ideas and then bring those ideas forward back again to Bob Iger's words and show you why Disney abandoned its traditional audience and really its traditional way of telling stories. Oh, I should also note that when he said the world is multicolored and multi-natured, he's talking about the fact that there's no fixed nature within human beings. I've talked about this many times on my channel. That is, of course, a giant assumption made by the proponents of people like critical race theory and its originating ideas, which basically boils down to what they're talking about here, the fact that you can't just make one story for everyone, even though he talks about universality. That's not exactly what he's talking about. You need to make it so that it appeals to the intersectionality of different things like being a woman, as well as the color of your skin, other things that make up identity markers. And of course, this is, once again, intersectional feminism. But that's a slight stretch from what he actually says here. So let's concentrate on the things he actually says about critical theory. Now, he doesn't call it that, but that's what it is. That's what he's talking about. Again, with all of these things he talks about at the end, people coming up to him saying, I need to have something to show my children where they have the same skin color. This is critical race theory. Now, what is critical race theory? Now, I've gone over this a number of times, so I'll do this with speed. Critical race theory comes from critical theory. Critical theory is a discipline that was created by a group of avowed Marxists. Why did they create it? Well, they created it because they looked at Marxism and its impact on history and said, the grand communist revolution is not proceeding the way that we thought it would. Marx seemed to have been wrong about the workers of the world uniting. Therefore, we have to come up with a new idea to sell the grand communist revolution to the world. Now, this took several decades, but it culminated within the Frankfurt School in the 1960s, and they came up with critical theory. Now, very briefly, we have to talk about what critical theory says it does, what it actually does, and how it operates, although those things are connected. So again, the purpose of it, it was specifically designed purposefully to start a new world communist revolution. How did it do that? How did it plan to do that? Well, it planned to do that by attacking its enemies with constant and relentless criticism. Therefore, criticism of their opponents could never be constructive in any way. It needed to be destructive always, so that it would chip away little by little at the underpinnings, the underlegs of Western civilization, which is the supporter of capitalism. And when that falls, because of this constant criticism taking out its legs, then the grand communist revolution will ensue. But how does it operate? Well, we see that right today with the people saying that, oh no, we're not teaching critical race theory within schools. There's nothing like that. Or if they finally get caught doing so, they say, well, it's just a way of looking at the world and analyzing things according to a different perspective. But the point is, that perspective that children today are being taught in school to use to analyze everything, that perspective assumes as a basic tenet of how it works that Marxism is true. It divides everybody up into oppressor and oppressed, which again is Marxism, and then feeds into the grievances of these different groups, and they use that grievance to then sell them. You must criticize your opponent, which is also our opponent, and take out its legs with constant and relentless criticism. And this translates into critical race theory because the critical theorists said, how do we sell critical theory to America? Well, we must sell it to America according to race, because the best way to take out America is to start wars based upon race, and that's how the grand communist revolution will take over America. By the way, this is not me being a conspiracy theorist. This is all straight up history. Go look up the Frankfurt School, critical theory, critical race theory. Go look it up on Wikipedia even, and you will see this is exactly what it is intended to do. Now, am I saying that Bob Iger is a secret communist and he's doing this to spread communism all over the world? No, I'm saying that his liberal education led him to believe that these kinds of ideas like critical theory were correct. Because some liberal educations, like mine, for instance, would present these different ideas and say, this is the conservative perspective, this is the liberal perspective, this is the communist perspective. And yes, we learned all about critical theory and critical race theory back in the 1990s in university, before anybody ever knew it was such a thing. But again, the Marxist idea is based upon no truth. That idea of no truth draws its origins from those Renaissance idea that we can't think about the truth when we analyze things. And so it would feed into very much a liberal arts education especially if the teachers wanted to push it in that direction, and it seems like Bob Iger's teachers did so, especially since they were in upstate New York, and you get a sort of very liberal to very progressive number of professors, etc., even back at Bob Iger's time when we went to university. But how does this all lead into what he talks about storytelling and how they abandon good stories and therefore abandon their traditional audience? Well, there is a part of critical race theory, which again is based upon Marxism. It is best explored in a book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment by Max Horkheimer and Theodore W. Adorno, if memory serves. They are two members of the Frankfurt School, avowed Marxists. So the Marxist idea is to get to a communist utopia in the future, and that future is the end of history. And how do you get to that end of history? Well, it is through a dialectic of enlightenment, which is to say, you have a dialectic of two ideas. So you have idea number one and idea number two, and both of them join together. They dovetail in a way that they produce a new idea, which is idea number three. Now, idea number three being the offspring of idea number one and idea number two, combining elements of both, becomes something better than either idea number one or idea number two. And of course, that third idea, that new idea, then becomes in itself a new idea number one, which is joined to another idea number two, and they are the parents of, again, a new idea number three, which is better than them. And it continually goes this way, ideas being replaced by better ideas, being replaced by better ideas, through this dialectic of the Enlightenment process, which, again, going back to the Renaissance, and I'm just going to throw in here, is it any wonder that the same Ta-Nehisi Coates that Bob Iger was talking about giving the Black Panther stories pedigree also wrote after that Captain America stories, where you had a organization called the Daughters of Liberty made up by women, and it began seriously in the Enlightenment. So it was an Enlightenment movement made up of only women, and these were the people who basically not only created Captain America, but kept him alive the entire time, because they would constantly rescue him, even though he wouldn't know it. And there's no indication of this ever happening in the stories, of course, but it is a way of nerfing that character of Steve Rogers, Captain America, because he didn't actually get through any of this on his own merit. It was the group of women protecting him all the time and their Enlightenment ideas. Just want to throw that out there. There's also a version of it within Marvel's newer version of Conan, where this old witch kept him alive in order to do a blood spell, and that's how he survived all of his conflicts. But anyway, the point is that these new ideas that get produced, since they are so superior to the old ideas then become irrelevant. And within the book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, they even go so far as to say, and what they're doing in that book is studying stories and narratives throughout history, starting from ancient times, to show this very dialectic of enlightenment through what? Through storytelling. But what they say in that book is that when this process happens and those two ideas join together to make a superior third, those old ideas are, and they put it in the terms of, they are placed behind a barrier of the unrepeatable. Therefore, they are old ideas which are no longer relevant in any way. If they try to be relevant, they will be automatically trounced by the new idea, which is better than them, and therefore those ideas are now irrelevant. And this is the exact mindset that Bob Iger has when he gives that first long quote that I talked about. He's talking about the religion of old Disney, of how people revered the old way of doing things. But of course, you can't revere the old way of doing things. Why? Because those old way of doing things are not part of this dialectical process. They are ideas that have to be discarded because we already have superior ideas to those ideas right now. You'll notice that when he says, we might as well put it in a glass case in a museum, he uses the neutral term we instead of saying I am doing this or other people are doing this. He says we. Why? Because he wants you to think that he means other people will do this if they continue to reverence it, when it's actually he himself doing it in his way of thinking that, no. You see, those things, those old ideas, that old way of operating, you can go ahead and put that in a glass case in a museum because it's a museum piece now. It is not relevant in any way. It's like finding the bones of a progenitor to Homo sapiens. It's a curiosity. It might help you think about other ideas, and he does talk about that here, that you gather information from these old things, but then you put them in a glass case because they're not relevant anymore. And you add that to the fact that he talks about these core brand values, and when he talks about those, it sounds like he's talking about the actual things within the history of Disney and things that we all probably in some form or another actually believe in, the ideas of good versus evil, respect for others, etc., etc. But of course, since there's no fixed point, there's no fixed notion within the universe, everything changes, language changes, ideas change, those things can now be redefined. Sure, back in 1920, they had an idea of good and evil. And sure, we have brought that forward to today, and Disney has an idea of good or evil. But the things that they believed in 1920 to be good, we now call evil. And the things that they thought in 1920 to be evil are now called good. You see how you can do the exact thing he says? Bring all of those ideas forward in the way that he's talking about, but as long as you understand there's no fixed points, then you can redefine them any way you want. And that's exactly what he's doing here. And that's part and parcel of there's a reverence for those old ideas, but no, they go in a glass case. We can't use those old ideas the way that they were used in 1920 anymore. Even though we still have ideas of good and evil, our ideas of good and evil are now superior to the ideas of good and evil from the 1920s. Or indeed of any other time within Disney's history, because he even says, we've moved on even from 10 years ago. So every decade successively becomes better and better. This is the entire idea behind progressivism. They are progressing. Towards what? Towards this grand communist utopia. And every time they progress, they place the history that they have gone through beyond the barrier of the unrepeatable. Yes, sure, they used it at that time, but it's now outdated. It's now abandoned for these new ways of doing things, these new ideas, because those new ideas that we have so-called progressed to are superior to all of the ideas of the past. And lest I be criticized as being someone who is blowing Bob Iger's words way out of proportion, let's look at what he says after that. He says that when he came into the company, it was made up mostly of these reverential people, these people who had reverence for this history, which is to say they didn't want to discard this history. And what does he say that he did? He said, well, he had to get rid of them all. Now, he doesn't use those terms. He says change. He says they needed to break that. They needed to attack that. And that meant changing out personnel. So when he talks about having respect, not reverence, for the past so that they can move with innovation into the future, and it needs to be that way, otherwise you will see innovation as being a threat, he's talking about the dialectic of enlightenment. He's saying, yes, those old ideas were the progenitors of this new idea, and we're going to continue to say we have these core brand values, even though we have redefined them to mean the exact opposite of what they originally meant. That's respect, not reverence. But the movement in this direction is the innovation. The dialectic of enlightenment is this innovation. By the way, I talked about this last week and a couple of months ago when I was covering the Writers Guild of America Association. They were talking about queering legacy characters, characters that have been around for 80 years in some instances. They were saying continuity is what? Well, it's emotional continuity. It's not something hard and fixed, not something objective. And add that to the idea of Kelly Sue DeConnick, which again I talked about last week, where she said she redefined the continuity of Captain Marvel. She's the one who created the Captain Marvel you see on the screen, redefined the character, really, by basically wiping the memory of the character and having I think it was 6-year-old girl tell her what her past was so that they could only keep the good bits. What are the good bits? And why does it have to be changed emotionally? Why? Because of this dialectic of enlightenment. You'll see that if you look at these people that are in control of Disney or Marvel or Star Wars or anything else that Pixar has to deal with, or other companies that are doing the same, they're saying that they're respecting the continuity of these characters and stories when most of us are looking at them going, huh? And they think they are Because, of course, the only part of the continuity that actually needs to be held onto are the parts that are progressive, other parts that led to the progressive point where they are right now. Anything else can be discarded because anything else is part of this dialectic of enlightenment. And it needs to be done emotionally because the entire thing is not rational. And I should also point out that I've done a number of videos a long time ago where you had people talking about the fact that if they wanted to work for the company, and it was not only for Disney or for Marvel, there was also people talking about it on podcasts who had worked on the new Star Trek television shows, saying that if we wanted to work on these properties that we loved desperately, we had to hide the fact that we were actual fans of this property. Why? Because you would be automatically put into that camp where Bob Iger says you're actually treating this as a religion. You're actually reverencing that past instead of respecting it. And what are you going to do? Well, you're going to fire those people, obviously, like Bob Iger fired all the other people who were there when he came in. The majority, he says, that were like that. He had to get rid of them because they don't adhere to this idea of the dialectic of enlightenment, which is the way progressivism works through society. And again, he probably doesn't really understand the whole process of this, but it doesn't matter. This is the origin and mindset of his education and what it has led him to. And it leads to other things that I've covered in my channel, like the second in command at Marvel Comics, almost at the same time as this Bob Iger interview, saying, well, you see, people think that they might want those old Marvel stories, but they really don't. That was a quote from her, by the way, but that's the exact same mindset. Or the mindset of one of the Marvel writers, I think it was Kelly Thompson, who said, we can chip away at that tent pole of white fanboys. Gotta get that white in there for that critical race theory connection, and got to get rid of those fanboys because they reverence these things in the past. And you can't do that. If you do that, you're not progressive. If you're not progressive, guess what? Since in the mind of all of these people, including Bob Iger, who is directing them all and telling them, do this, make a Black Panther movie. I don't care. It's a mandate from me. What they're saying is that, or what their beliefs are leading them to do, is to make this statement that progressivism is absolutely true. It is on the right side of history. It is leading us into new territory continually within history. All of those other things from the past are now outdated and must be discarded. And if you are a fan, not of the current product, but of the stories from the past, you too must be discarded. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and a return to form for low fantasy. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from those books in the background. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later.